There is a particular quiet that belongs to lost places. It is not the loud, theatrical quiet of a ruined cathedral or a burned library, but a slow, saline hush that settles across continental shelves, where the maps turn blue and stay blue for thousands of miles. It is the silence of landscapes whose names are spoken only in fragments, in island myths, in a lone folktale sung by an elderly islander, in the footnote of a 19th century naturalist's paper. For generations, those fragments were called fantasy, Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, words that happily sold books and filled late-night radio with conspiracy and wonder. But beneath the myths live other, steadier things. Shorelines, river mouths, peat beds, layers of forest soil pressed into the ocean floor. The bones of animals hunted and the flints of people who stood where fishing boats now drift. The modern story begins with a hard question. What did we lose when the last great thaw finally let the oceans rise? This is not a speculative movie about crystal cities and secret races. It is an attempt to reconcile three truths that seldom meet in a single frame. First, the human tendency to make myth from absence, to invent whole lands out of what is missing on a map. Second, the scientific record, patient and accumulating. Certain drowned lands are demonstrably real, their outlines recoverable in sonar and sediment cores. And third, the human costs of vanishing shorelines, lives, cultures, and knowledge erased not by gods, but by slow processes, glacial melt, storms, and the patient work of tides. The moral center of this film is not a detective's triumph over mystery, but the quiet obligation to listen to what the seabed can tell us. That the past is not simply written on dry land, and that many of the stories we were taught to call myth may begin with very human, very verifiable losses. Here we will meet the lands that lie between myth and evidence, Zealandia, Sunderland, Doggerland, and we will learn the difference between a geological continent and a folkloric continent, between evidence and wish. Scientific teams have argued that an underwater mass called Zealandia meets the definitions of a continent, an idea that rewrites the simple map of 7 dry land masses into an 8-fold geography of our planet. That finding, which gathered force with a defining paper and mapping projects in the last decade, shows how a hidden continental crust can exist and be scientifically characterized even while it sits mostly beneath the waves. At the same time, the islands and plains that once knit modern Indonesia into a vast habitable sundershelf were exposed during the last ice ages, and are now lost to us beneath 100-meter sea rises that followed the warming. And in northern Europe, Doggerland, a plain that connected Britain to the continent and hosted Mesolithic communities, was swallowed by a series of sea rises and waves that carved the coastline into the shape we now call familiar. These are not fantasy. They are material facts recovered in cores and sonar, in archaeological finds dredged up by trawlers, and in gravity maps of the ocean floor. To treat all vanished land stories as equal would be to erase this difference. To treat only the scientific as relevant would be to miss the human hunger that produces myth. Our film will move carefully between both worlds, honoring data and honoring longing, and asking what it means that entire geographies and human histories can be made invisible in the space of a few centuries. For that reason, we begin here, in the hush where myth and geology meet, because understanding the quiet will prepare us to hear the drowned city's echoes when we finally go down. Zealandia, an 8-continent idea, the science and its human significance. In 2017, a group of geologists published a paper that stopped the sleepy certainties of a generation. Beneath New Zealand and New Caledonia lies a coherent patch of continental crust they called Zealandia, roughly 2/3 the size of Australia and 94% submerged. The paper did not suggest lost palaces. It offered instead geologic proof that continents do not always sit high and dry like islands wearing crowns. Zealandia was formed as a fragment of Gondwana and later thinned and sank, a geological act that left most of its mass below the Pacific. To many, the headline was almost a provocation. The world has an eighth continent hiding in plain sight beneath a sea that has over the last centuries been charted in exquisite detail, but whose geology had been understood only slowly. The discovery was not a claim about vanished civilizations, but a reorientation of the map. It underlines that our categories, continent, island, oceanic crust, are human and contingent, not sacred.
This is important because the idea of a lost continent has for centuries blurred the line between sober evidence and elaborate storytelling. Zealandia is a tidy corrective, a legitimate geological entity that shows how continental crust can persist underwater without being mystical. The geologists who worked on Zealandia produced seismic surveys, rock samples, and mapping that demonstrate continental composition, light granitic rocks, metamorphic basements, and sedimentary basins, different from oceanic basalt. These are the kinds of load-bearing facts that allow scientists to say with confidence, this is continental crust, not mere submerged volcanic chains. The mapping projects that followed have only deepened this finding. In 2023, New Zealand's Geological Service announced an unprecedented, high-resolution mapping of the area that frames Zealandia not as a rumor but as a documented part of Earth's architecture. This matters for more than taxonomy. In human terms, learning Zealandia's story forces us to ask how we think about disappearance. Zealandia's loss was not sudden. It is the long, patient consequence of plate tectonics and crustal thinning that lowered elevations and allowed the sea to claim what had once been land or near land. Unlike the sudden catastrophe imagined in many legends, Zealandia's story is a geological persistence. It also serves as a useful example for how science can demystify and, at the same time, deepen the awe around lost lands. We do not need fantasies about advanced lost races to feel wonder. The planet's slow motions are wonder enough. That said, the public hunger for dramatic narratives means that discoveries like Zealandia are immediately folded into older mythologies, a process we will next inspect because it shows how culture and science co-author the stories we tell about the past. Sundaland and the submerged plains of Southeast Asia, human lives on a vanished shelf. If Zealandia changes the map, Sundaland changes the human story. The Sunda Shelf, the shallow continental extension that once connected Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula into one vast plain, was exposed during the last glacial maximum when sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than today. For thousands of years, that shelf was not an empty field, but a mosaic of rivers, lakes, forests, and hunting grounds. Recent research marrying genetics, archaeology, paleobotany, and sedimentology shows that the people who lived on the Sunda Shelf were part of complex webs of movement and adaptation. New genetic studies published in recent years have begun to reveal the routes and timings of migrations that knit Southeast Asia and Oceania together. And paleo-environmental reconstructions make clear that the landscape there was dynamic. A savanna corridor in some periods, a mosaic forest in others, but habitably rich. As the ice sheets melted and global sea level rose, the plain was swallowed, sometimes gradually, sometimes in pulses driven by meltwater pulses and storm surges, transforming human lifeways and forcing migrations into higher ground. These losses were not merely of land, but of memory. River courses altered, species ranges contracted, and entire cultural geographies, ceremony places, resource zones, kinship routes were rearranged or lost entirely. The human scale of Sunderland's drowning is still being measured. Archaeologists and marine geologists have begun to recover submerged middens and fossil fauna from seabed cores and trawl finds, showing that people, hippos, elephants, and giant tortoises once roamed landscapes now underneath the Java Sea. In the last few years, research teams publishing in high-quality journals have leveraged these finds to argue for direct prehistoric interactions and even previously unknown hominin presence in parts of the shelf. Evidence that compels us to reconsider Southeast Asia's centrality in early human history rather than treating it as a peripheral set of islands. At the same time, we must be careful. The idea of a single glorious sunken civilization ruling all of Sunderland is a seductive fiction. The truth is more complex and more human. Many local communities adapted in uneven ways to rising waters. Some moved inland and reconfigured livelihoods. Some shifted to maritime living. Others suffered catastrophic displacement. These losses were not merely of land, but of memory. River courses altered, species ranges contracted, and entire cultural geographies, ceremony places, resource zones, kinship routes were rearranged or lost entirely. The human scale of Sunderland's drowning is still being measured. Archaeologists and marine geologists have begun to recover submerged middens and fossil fauna from seabed cores and trawl finds, showing that people, hippos, elephants, and giant tortoises once roamed landscapes now underneath the Java Sea. In the last few years, research teams publishing in high-quality journals have leveraged these finds to argue for direct prehistoric interactions and even previously unknown hominin presence in parts of the shelf. Evidence that compels us to reconsider Southeast Asia's centrality in early human history rather than treating it as a peripheral set of islands. At the same time, we must be careful. The idea of a single glorious sunken civilization ruling all of Sunderland is a seductive fiction. The truth is more complex and more human. Many local communities adapted in uneven ways to rising waters. Some moved inland and reconfigured livelihoods. Some shifted to maritime living. Others suffered catastrophic displacement. The archaeological record is fragmentary because much of it lies offshore. But with new cores, underwater remote sensing, and interdisciplinary analysis, scientists are knitting back together how people once lived across a landscape that the modern map refuses to show. The story of Sunderland, therefore, asks us to combine biological, geological, and cultural evidence to reconstruct human lives that the ocean swallowed, a process that makes history less about monumental ruins and more about daily practices, diets, and griefs. Doggerland, footprints in the North Sea and a Europe that was. If Sunderland teaches scale and complexity, Doggerland teaches intimacy and an almost unbearable closeness. In the shallow basin now called the Dogger Bank, between Britain and continental Europe, lay a sprawling plain that was home to Mesolithic communities for millennia. As the ice retreated after the last glacial age, rivers carved valleys through a landscape teeming with game, and archaeologists today find that many Mesolithic sites are preserved beneath the North Sea's silt. The finds are astonishing in their ordinariness. Hearthstones, flint tools, and even human footprints preserved in peat and clay that, once dredged up, tell of daily life rather than royal myths. The flooding of Doggerland was a drawn-out process, punctuated by catastrophic events. One of the most discussed is the Storegga Slide, a massive underwater landslide off Norway roughly 8,200 years ago that generated a tsunami capable, according to some models, of delivering a sudden, devastating wave across the flooded plain. For coastal communities, the impact would have been mortal, but the broader drowning of Doggerland was due to steadily rising seas that, in the span of a few thousand years, turned livable plains into submerged banks. National Geographic's reporting and other syntheses of recent research show how piecing together cores, seismic surveys, and finds from trawlers can reconstruct the coastline and the river systems that sustained life. What is most heart-wrenching about Doggerland is the way in which the sea didn't just take property or land, it reconfigured the sense of belonging and memory. For inhabitants facing a slowly advancing shoreline, knowledge, burial places, and symbolic landscapes were lost, perhaps with personal urgency that has no modern analog. But Doggerland also offers archaeological opportunities. Because so much of the site lies underwater, the preservation conditions for organic material can be exceptional, turning marine sediment into an archive that tells us the names of trees, the diets of people, and the seasons of hunting. The North Sea's bed, in short, is not an empty blue room. It is a library of displaced lives. Recovering that library will take new maritime archaeology practices, legal frameworks that allow research in economic zones, and patience. Yet the fragments we have recovered, footprints, a hearthstone, a file of flint, already force a profound humility. Whole geographies can vanish while leaving behind only the faintest human traces. Myths, modern appropriation, and the danger of false certainty. Lemuria, Mu, Atlantis. If the sea can erase towns, it can also create appetite, the desire to believe in grand civilizations that predate known history. Here we must widen our lens to examine the cultural machinery that transforms absence into empire. In the mid-19th century, zoologists and naturalists, confronted with biogeographic puzzles, why certain animals occur where they do, sometimes posited submerged land bridges or sunken continents to explain patterns they could not otherwise reconcile. Lemuria and Mu arose in this intellectual moment. Lemuria began as a scientific hypothesis to account for puzzling distributions of lemur fossils between Madagascar and India, long before continental drift was widely accepted. Later, occultists, writers, and popularizers grabbed the notion and turned it into origin stories of human races and advanced ancient knowledge, sometimes overlaying the idea with racialized or teleological claims that suited colonial imaginations. James Churchward, Augustus Laplanjon, and others promoted Mu and links between disparate ancient civilizations, weaving them into narratives that offered comfort to curiosity and profit to sales. But the tectonic revolution of the 20th century, Wegener's continental drift and later plate tectonics, provided the mechanism that made those 19th century hypotheses obsolete. Land masses move. Species distributions are explained by long-term continental connections, not submerged civilizations in the Pacific or Indian Oceans. Professional geologists have demonstrated that the geological structures do not support a sunken supercontinent beneath, say, the Indian Ocean in the way those early writers imagined. That does not mean that every claim of submerged human habitation is false. Doggerland and Sunderland show that large habitable areas have drowned. But it does mean that the popular image of a single, global, technologically advanced Atlantis-style civilization emerging to teach all the world's peoples is unsupported by evidence and often serves anxieties or ideological agendas. The danger is not merely academic. When myth masquerades as proof, it can be used to justify modern political myths, claims about origins, ownership, or destiny. Our obligation as storytellers and historians is therefore double: to preserve the wonder of myth while rigorously separating it from the evidence, to honor indigenous oral memories that sometimes encode real events, sudden floods, migrations, sea changes, without reading into them anachronistic grandeur, and to expose appropriation that turns vanished lives into symbols for modern agendas. The lesson is this: missing land is real. Missing empires, as described in sensational retellings, almost never are. Recognizing that difference is essential if we are to be honest about the past and humane about its survivors. Methods of recovery: how scientists listen to drowned landscapes, technology, ethics, and new finds. Recovering a lost landscape is not the work of a heroic archaeologist with a trowel on a beach. It is a shamefully collaborative feat that relies on sonar mapping, seismic imaging, sediment core chemistry, ancient DNA in mud layers, radiocarbon dating, and, crucially, interdisciplinary humility. Oceanographers map the seafloor with multi-beam sonar that reveals buried river channels and paleo shorelines. Geologists take cores that show peat layers and soil horizons, the fingerprints of former forests. Paleobotanists read pollen trapped in those sediments to reconstruct the vegetation. Geneticists compare human and animal DNA to chart population movement across the now drowned corridors. The confluence of these methods has led to discoveries that once would have been dismissed as fantasy. As recently as the last decade, regional mapping efforts have transformed Zealandia from a speculative construct into an mappable geological unit. And marine archaeology projects have begun to extract human remains, tools, and middens from the seabed of the Sunda Shelf and the North Sea, turning blue space into an archive. But technical capacity brings ethical questions. Who owns the past when it lies under international waters? What rights do coastal and indigenous communities have to artifacts recovered from places that were once their ancestral lands? Those questions are not rhetorical. They define how research is framed and how its benefits are distributed. Several pioneering projects now engage coastal communities as partners, blending oral histories with scientific discovery and offering participatory frameworks that return knowledge and agency to descendant groups. Politically, the work also intersects with modern coastal vulnerability. As contemporary sea levels rise again, the stories of Doggerland and Sunderland are not mere antiquarian curiosities, they are urgent analogs. We know now, from cores and models, that sea level rise can happen rapidly in pulses, driven not just by melting ice, but by complex feedbacks. The archaeological record of drowned landscapes thus becomes a cautionary archive. It shows the human scale of displacement, the fragility of coastal economies, and the long tail of ecological change. Recovering the past, therefore, becomes a civic act. It helps us understand what kinds of adaptations succeed, which social networks can absorb shocks, and what kinds of knowledge vanish when communities are forced to flee. Science gives us the tools to read the drowned world. Ethics gives us the rules to do so without repeating the injustices that often accompanied early excavations and colonialist collection. The future of this field belongs to collaborative projects that marry technical excellence with moral seriousness. Projects that see the seabed not as treasure to be plundered, but as an archive to be stewarded. Why remembering matters, restitution, contemporary resonance, and the quiet duty of history. At the end of this descent beneath the blue, we return to a question that is both simple and stubborn. Why should we care? The answer is not merely intellectual curiosity, though that is part of it, but a moral and political imperative. Remembering lost lands and the people who lived on them is an act of restitution. For communities whose stories have been rendered invisible by maps, the recovery of submerged landscapes offers tangible recognition of ancestral places, of the struggles that shaped modern settlement patterns, and of the genealogies that tie modern peoples to vanished geographies. This is not nostalgia for an impossible restoration. We cannot reconstruct Sunderland or Doggerland in full. But we can reconstruct enough to honor the people who once lived there, to re-embed their experiences in historical understanding, and to learn from them. On a contemporary level, the drowned landscapes are a mirror and a warning. Sea level rise is not an ancient problem alone. It is unfolding in our own generation. The same processes that erased Doggerland are, in slow motion, altering Bangladeshi deltas, Pacific atolls, and coastal zones from Florida to Lagos. If the past shows us how communities coped by migration, by hybridizing lifeways, or sometimes by suffering catastrophic loss, then it also suggests that policy and compassion matter. The final humility this story demands is also practical. The sea keeps its traces, but it keeps them on its own terms. Our job as historians and as citizens is to listen patiently, to build science that is accountable, and to tell narratives that neither elevate myth over method nor erase the human hunger that invented myth in the first place. The world does pretend, sometimes, that vanished places never existed. Cartographers color them with blue and move on, but when we look under the waves, when we read sediments and DNA and sonar pulses, we find people. Their lives were not less real because their shores are gone. The simplest restitution we can offer is testimony. To name the landforms, to read the cores, to tell the stories in ways that are honest, nuanced, and attentive to those who descend from the drowned. That attention is the sum of our duty, to know the past, to safeguard the data, and to let the sea's quiet no longer be an excuse for forgetting. In that remembering, we find both caution and consolation, the human capacity to continue in the face of loss, and the obligation to do better tomorrow because of what we have learned beneath the waves.